Hello and welcome again to Abbitt Media. This is the third part of the collaboration with Jayanam, and you can see the final shield model just here. Have a look in the description for the other parts. I'm going to dive straight into the texture painting now. So in order to start texture painting, we can go to our texture painting tab just here. And you can see instantly that it all goes purple. That's because it's got no texture. Now I like to see what's going on with my node, so I always bring down a node editor as well, or a shader editor as it's now called. So grab the tiny corner bit up here and pull it down and change this to the shader editor. Now at the moment it's got no material, but as soon as I click here to add a new base color, and let's change this to a mid-gray color around there. We don't need the alpha, so we can turn that off. Let's double this to 2048 for a really detailed texture and press OK. So as soon as I do that, it sets up a material for me and it's got that base color plugged into the color output. Let's press N to get rid of the panel, we don't need that. And the last thing before painting, make sure you have the Node Wrangler installed. So edit, preferences, cross to add-ons and type in Node. There's the Node Wrangler, make sure that's ticked, it will make your life much easier. Close that down. So when I press Control Shift, left click on my texture, it creates the viewer node. And that's really important for texture painting. You can press Control Shift left click to take you back to the principled shader whenever you need to. And I'll be doing that now and again whilst painting. Let's zoom into my texture here, make sure I can see it nice and easily. Move this across a bit and give myself lots of space. And then go across to Look Dev mode, which is this button here. You can see that grey colour that I've put on everything. So the first thing to do is fill in our base colours. The easiest way to do that is with the fill brush, and I'll start with the middle here and I'll fill it in with a grey metallic colour. So fill brush down to a fairly dark grey, somewhere around there, and we fill it in. But it's filling in my entire shape, so I'll undo that. What I want to do is just select that area. I need to press Tab to go into edit mode, press Alt A to remove all the selection, and then L to just select that area. That's another great thing about marking seams, is that I can actually do that. Press the L, link selection, which is down here, and I'm selecting by seamed area, so that's this area here. If I press L over the wood, it will select that area as well. I'll undo that. Let's go back into texture paint mode with Tab, and now if I tap, it still does everything. That's because I need to press this button here, Paint Mask, and now it just masks that area. Let's turn this up to 100% and fill it in. We need to do the same for the outside area, so let's press Alt A to deselect all, L to select the outside, and fill that in. The same with all the metallic bits. You can select them all at once if you want, and fill them in. Do remember the other side. Now it's a bit tough to see, it looks all dark here, so it's tough to see the change in colour, even though we are on Look Dev mode. That's because it's going through the principled shader and it is being affected by the shape. But if I Control left click on the base color and just get that viewer node, now we can start to see the difference in the colors. So if I select all with A, you can now see the difference in colors. Okay, so let's work on the wood first. Back into edit mode, Alt A to deselect all, and L just to select the wood. I'm going to select the other side at the same time, so L with the other side as well. So when I start painting in here, I want it to affect the back, so I don't have to paint that as well. Now what I can do when I go back to texture paint mode, or you can just press Tab to switch between the two, I can go to my paintbrush, and down at the bottom of your menus you've got symmetry, and I want to turn the symmetry in the Z axis on. So I paint on the top and it will appear on the bottom. So let's just test that's working. Let's go across to the blue or something, paint there, and it comes out on the bottom as well. Of course I need to fill that, so let's go to our fill brush, find a nice browny colour, somewhere around there, slightly towards the reds I prefer, and let's fill that in. Now when painting wood, I always go about it the same way, so across to my draw brush, let's sample that colour, S to get your pipette or picker, and I can then S and left click on that, and it should come into my colour palette just there. Now I'm going to bring the strength down to about 3, about mid-tone, fairly small brush, and just paint some streaks in there like that, very basic to start with, different colour, and just keep creating these streaks. Now let's change the brush size a bit, create some more streaks, and that just offers a bit of variation in our wood to start with. Vary the colour lots, and bring the size of the brush down. Don't always go all the way across, so you can get some little ones here and there like this. And that's a nice base for some wood. Then I go across to the multiply brush. So the multiply brush makes things darker. You need a nice dark brush for this, or I should be sampling these colours as well. So every time you choose a colour, press the little plus icon just here. I can get the other ones back later. Now when I'm using the multiply brush, let's get our sort of base colour, which is about there, sort of fairly orangey brown. I like to go a sort of darkish reddy colour for wood. I think that helps. Now for this, we want it to be fairly symmetrical across the x-axis, so I'll turn the symmetry on just for the moment on the x-axis, and let's draw a line down. Okay, that's a dreadful line, so let's go to top view so I can be a bit more accurate. So 7 on your numpad, undo that, and let's try that again. Do this by hand, don't choose the line method, and just undo until you get a nice stroke going all the way down. There we go. There and there. So I had my strength on about 0.3. Now I can make my brush a bit smaller by pressing the F key and just stroke my way down there to make that a bit deeper. And that looks fine. Maybe a tiny bit smaller as well, just to get right in there in that sort of crevice. That's great. Now to the screen brush. The screen brush lightens, so the opposite of the multiply. Now I go for a really light brown and more towards the centre, maybe towards the yellows a bit more this time. And a nice light colour. Fairly big brush, and just on the outlines now. I think my brush is a touch too large, so I'll undo that. And you want it to be fairly wobbly, because that adds to the sort of natural look. So these are the very edges as if they're catching the light a bit. There we go. Now where the shield meets the edge of the metal, and that's just like ambient occlusion, the light can't get in there. So let's get to the multiply brush again. Fairly dark, but slightly lighter in terms of the brush strength. So about 0.2. And just delicately brush around. In fact, I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to go to the y-axis as well. Then I only need to do quarter. Try and be as efficient as you can. And very gently. I'm using a Wacom tablet, so I've got pen pressure. And most tablets do that. So if you're using a drawing tablet, this is much easier. So some in the middle here as well. And some around these supporting braces just around there. And can you see the depth that's adding? And that looks great. Now that's nice and simple. Now generally I like to add a bit of detail as well, but you might be happy at this point. But using your multiply brush on a fairly high strength now, let's go for a nice reddy colour again. I'm going to add that one to my colour palette. Nice and dark. Just add a few swirls. Now remember that you've got symmetry on, so I'll undo that and turn X and Y off, because this is where we don't want any symmetry. So I'm using some swirls for some knots, like this. So it looks like natural wood. Just gently put in some splits like this. Now you may want to vary the colour slightly as well. Now let's go to the screen brush for the lighter areas. So a nice light colour. Going to go for a sort of yellowy colour again. Somewhere around there. A bit smaller on the strength and a bit smaller on the brush size. That's way too small. Now what I might do is actually turn my radius on in terms of pressure sensitivity. That means how hard I push will actually affect the brush size. So I'm just coming in here and adding to these knots. And that's already looking nice. I might want to up the detail level a bit, so going with a small brush, come across these edges here, so they're really highlighted and really hitting the light and really catching the light. So this is with a really small brush. Notice I haven't put symmetry back on because I actually want them to be fairly sort of random now. So change the colour up a bit, and let's just add a tiny bit of variation in here. Don't always go straight lines, a few wobbly lines as well. Gives it that character. Changing the brush size and the colour. You can even go a little bit more extreme and change it to sort of greeny colours as well. And there we go, it's looking quite nice. Now the last bit, I think it needs just a tiny bit more detail around the edges. So I'll change the screen brush to the multiply brush, and I'm going to go around the edges again. I will turn the X and Y mirror on just for the moment, but when I get to where they meet, I might turn it off. I'll explain more in a second. So to my red colour again, maybe I'll just bring it slightly browner, just for the sake of variation. Fairly small brush, but I want to get into these crevices to give it a bit more depth in these areas. So where they meet, you might want to turn symmetry off, but actually it's fine at the moment, so we're not having any problems with that symmetry. Occasionally where they meet, it just looks a bit odd, but in this case it doesn't, it's fine. So I'm still in that isolation mode, painting just on these faces. Okay, that looks fine. I just really quickly deepen those just to touch some of these areas. Oh, careful, you've got symmetry on. That's what I forget quite often, so you've got to watch out for that. And there's the wood. So onto the metal bit. But before you do that, let's go across to image and save our image. So save as, shield color. And now we can start painting the metal. So in order to select the metal, we need to press Ctrl I for the inverse. And now we've got all the metal bits selected. And let's make sure that our symmetry is still on Z. We will have slight issues where they meet here, but we'll be able to sort that out after we've painted. I've got my paintbrush selected still, so I'm going to go to the mix mode and across to the sort of blues this time, only slightly into the colour. Nice big brush and just dab around a bit. You might not notice this so much on your screens, but it's adding just a tiny bit of colour. And in fact, I'm going to use the X and Y for now, so I just dab in a bit of colour around the place. You can probably just about see it there. Let's sample that and choose a different blue. And over to the purples. Sample that. Oh, I should have sampled the other blue, shouldn't I? Not that it matters too much. So it's always important to add variation to your fill colour to start with. Let's add a lighter purple, a little bit lighter on that one. Across to the blues again. Okay, so we're ready for a bit more detail now. Let's move in and start with the middle bit. So let's go across to the multiply and just fill in the edges to give it that bit of shading. Still got my symmetry on, and it should be coming across in the back side as well. Now that's interesting, that suggests the sizes were different. I should have checked that really, but that doesn't matter too much. I can smudge that out in a bit. So I'll have to go back in and paint the bottom areas for this. At this point I started getting a bit of a glitch in the X and Y axis, so I turned those off, but I was still getting a glitch, and I think it was in the Z axis as well. Not sure why that was, so I just had to turn them all off and try again. So I'm just going around filling in the crevices where there'd be some ambient occlusion. Basically drawing in with the multiply brush, fairly dark, not too high a strength, just enough to show the crevices. Now at this point you might want to turn back on the principled BSDF, and then you can see exactly where your edge is and you can follow it round. Otherwise you might miss the edge slightly. So I'm just going around each of these and filling in that edge with some detail. It would help if my mirror wasn't glitching. I'm not quite sure why that is. And back to the material base colour when you're finished with those. Now we want the inside of our shield to be slightly darker as well, so I'll come into here, I'll try the mirror again, X and Y, and come around the inside and see how we get on. So that one seems to be going okay. So again, this is a bit like the natural sort of ambient occlusion where the light can't hit, but it's also imagining that the light is hitting this area more than it's hitting the inside there. You also have to imagine that your shield has a top and a bottom, because the bottom will be slightly darker than the top and the light will be catching more at the top. So I'm going to assume that's the back of the Y, just there, that way around, if I look at my Cartesian coordinates. And it's worth thinking about that and bearing that in mind. So the back side, I'll keep X and Y on and I'll just multiply the back side a bit. I'm still fairly rough at this stage, as you can probably tell. Let's choose a different colour and slightly darker, coming into these really crevicy bits in here. It's really nice to do a collaborative project, so thanks very much, Jayanam. It's well worth collaborating with people. It's very likely that in the industry you're going to have to do certain parts of a character or certain parts of a model. So it's a really good thing to get used to and to learn from. Okay, so we've got a bit of a colour at the bottom there. I want a bit brighter at the top. So let's go to the screen brush, make it nice and light. I'll go for a slightly off white, just go round and give that a bit more white. Again, you can see I'm being quite rough, but it's giving it a bit of texture then. And then I can go in and give it the detail and smudge out any bits that have distorted or anything like that. Okay, so with the screen brush still on, let's turn the strength up. And you go a bit higher this time. Remember the strength for my wood was around 2. Well, this time I'm going a bit higher, maybe 3 to 3.5, somewhere around there. In on the white, and I'm going to do some highlights. So nice small-ish brush and highlight around. So I'm getting those edges. And again, it can be quite wobbly because the metal, you've got to imagine, is being sort of pulled around the place a bit and bashed in. So I'm just following the natural line around, but wobbling around as well. Hopefully I'll make sense with my terms, wobbling around. Don't worry too much about overlaps like that. You can get away with them in the next stage. I'll show you what I mean. Now can you see I've gone way off here, but what you can do when you do that is have an extra bit as if there's a big dent in there. You'll see the idea as we go along a bit more, but hopefully you're getting the idea at the moment. So around these bits as well. Yeah, watch out for that, where it sort of sprays out across the mesh. And done the same there actually. Got to take a bit more care. And we need it on the inside here as well. You can go back to the principal BSDF if you want to see the shape more, and I think that'll be helpful for me because I'm making a bit of a hash of it in places. It's just much more difficult to see your brush stroke when you're using this mode. Now notice I'm not worrying too much about the underside. One, it won't be seen so much in game, I'm assuming, and two, I'm just trying to be quick for the tutorial. Every now and again just check how you're getting on. Shift, Control, left click. And you can start to see it come to life a fair bit already, just with the highlights and that shading, and we'll get more to the detail in a moment. Now there are ways with complex node structures of getting a sort of hand-painted feel without hand painting, but I actually find it quicker to hand paint, even though this is quite a long process, and I suppose it's very skilled. I still find it easier and quicker to get the look that I want from hand painting rather than procedural textures. Okay, so I've got most of the highlights. I still haven't done the bolts yet, but I'll come to those in a minute. What I'm going to show you is how you can make sort of notches and dents. So in certain areas you might want to smudge out a bit, so let's make that brush quite big. Go to the smudge brushes there, fairly high strength, about halfway, and just smudge it out a bit. Like that, so it blends into each other. It doesn't matter too much, it doesn't have to be too detailed, just like that is fine for the moment. Back to your draw brush, small size, and then just make that highlight a bit bigger, like so. That's probably a bit too big. Like so. And then you highlight these edges here, and the bottom edge as if it's being hit by the light. Now remember, I'm imagining the light is coming down from here, so this bit here will catch more light, and this bit just on the edge will catch a bit of extra light, and then back to the multiply brush. Make your brush dark. This bit will catch the shade. Catch the shade, is that right? Will be excluded from the light. And there we go, we've got a dent. So combined with dents, it's a good idea to have some scratches. So with the multiply brush, we can scratch across fairly big, broad scratches at times, and then smaller brush and make it a firmer dent, especially where it hits the corner there. So we've got 2 scratches there, and then back to the screen brush for our highlights. So sun coming down from here, it's going to hit the bottom. Oh, brighter brush. Just there, and just there. And suddenly we got some scratches. They're a tiny bit dark, but we'll leave it like that for the moment. I might put a third one in. They're very uniform at the moment, so I'll just put a third one in to give it a bit more randomness. There we go. So there's scratches, dents, and just generally you want some lighter dents and some lighter spots. So if I go for the screen brush but fairly low, somewhere around here, quite a big brush, I might go a touch lower actually, and just give it some swirls around the place. This will make sense in a second. Just a few swirls. I'll come back to this bigger dent in a second. So there, a few swirls onto the multiply brush, quite big, fairly dark, low strength, and just give it some shade around those swirls as if the light's catching it in different places. And we've got very slight undulations in the metal. So choose a sort of side as if there is a dent. Okay, back to this particular dent. Look for where the positive is, so it's there. And a bit of the screen brush. There we go. So I'm going to create a few more of those sort of dents and scratches around the place. Now if you're interested in hand painting, I've got a playlist with lots of hand painting techniques on it. It's got an introduction to that. It's also got an introduction there, so it's a good idea to have a look at that if you're confused by anything that I'm doing here. Jayanam also has his videos set up in playlists, and it's a really good way to learn. You can look at a whole section of tutorials in order, and it can really boost your learning in that way. I'll try and remember to put cards in the corner. I often forget. But anyway, back to the shield. You can see me going around with a few dents, a few scratches and things, and I'm experimenting in the middle here, just having a go at doing some weird shapes. Just always consider where the light's hitting and the shadows are being created. So a few light scratches here and there. Can put a fair few of these on actually. They can be both screen and multiply, and you might want some next to each other, catching the highlight, which suggests a further dent. But you don't always need to have them next to each other. They can actually just be independent, tiny scratches. So at the moment it's not got much depth, so I need to add a bit more detail to the highlights and the crevices. So back to the multiply brush, and let's really start thinking about where the light's coming from. It's coming down here, so there's my y-axis. It would make more sense if I had it upright, but it doesn't matter too much. So there's going to be more of a shadow down here. So a bit closer in this time, a bit more care taken, and let's come in here with a dark brush. Doesn't have to be too strong. Just come around here and make sure that's quite clear in terms of defining the shape now. And we might want quite a dark line in here. I'm going to help it out here as well, but not so much because this is the top obviously. Okay, so screen brush on this side, a light colour, and then a lot brighter highlight down this edge where it's catching the light. So you do have to consider that the light is coming from a direction. Not so much because your game may have lights coming from different angles, but generally you have a sort of 12 o'clock lighting. So in this case, coming from the top just here. Same in here, we can actually make this top brighter, and especially this line down here where it's catching the light, and then a lot darker in here, a lot darker around here. So always thinking about where the light's shining and where it's hitting. You can see I'm still being fairly rough with it actually. It does depend on how much time you have, but can you see that's starting to give it some depth now, coming from there? And when you move close in, it looks a tiny bit rough. but you won't really get this close, to be honest. I'm assuming in your game you won't get this close. You can come across the shield a bit there as well, as if the light's coming from here and giving it some shadow. And now we've got much more of a sense of depth there. Let's work on the bolts now. Let's have a look at those. So let's zoom in here. Tough to see at the moment. We can always go to our prints board, BSDF, and start colouring in there. So with the multiply nice and low, let's go around the base. Probably a bit more strength on my brush. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, that's good. Now in a modelling sense, a hexagonal nut, or in fact pentagonal nut, is better. But in a painting sense, a circular one is slightly easier to manage. So let's have a look where our light's coming from, that angle there. So always looking at my sort of positive Y up there in my Cartesian coordinates. So it's going to be dark down the bottom here. Then go for the screen and make it light on the top. And let's highlight this very top and down the edges here as well. Okay, how's that looking? Now, because I was so zoomed in, I went fairly narrow with my highlights. Can probably go a bit thicker, really. Now that highlight can't be more than this highlight here because they're in the same spot and they're the same metal, so make that the same as this one. Now it's working reasonably well. Let's just turn off isolation mode so we can see the whole shield, and it's coming together quite nicely. I'm happy to turn off isolation mode now completely because I'd like to work on the wood as well at times, so let's do that. Now metal has really quite harsh highlights, as in very bright highlights, as it reflects the sun and the light. So it's worth really going for it with your highlights in places. Take some care though. So I'm going to start really thinking about the light coming from this direction now and give some shading in certain areas. So I've got quite a light colour, so it's a low strength in a sense for this. So very low strength coming around these areas to give them some shade. Really big brush now, getting this bottom bit to have a darker area than the top bit. Might even go brighter on the top bit as well. Careful of the strength there though, because I've got a light brush. Now these bits down here will catch the light coming from down here, so I can be fairly strong here. Have some fun highlighting these areas that are catching the light down here. And it's starting to come to life now. And it is just a combination of that multiply brush along with the screen brush, and it slowly builds up and gets there. So with my brush there, I'm really sort of wobbling it around the place. I can't describe these actions that I'm doing, but to give it an undulating surface rather than going a straight line like that. So really wobbling it around. And now I'll go in with my multiply brush, do the same on the bottom. So if it's been bashed around and got some dents in it and things. Now I'm going into the wood here as well with this one. So I think that'd be quite fun. To the screen brush. Always the same technique really. This is a little bit too white, so I'm just going to quickly grab my yellowy colour with some mix. In fact, I'll sample this. I think we need a few more of these big chunky marks like that as well. I think that'll look good. probably a bit too dark for the top, so you can always go over with the screen to sort of null it out a bit. Now I've completely forgotten about these spiky bits, so let's work on those a bit. So let's just zoom in on it, and from the top, just use your screen brush as a circle, round and round like this, and eventually it looks like sort of a sharp point. Probably a bit too much at the moment, and then round with the multiply brush. I might need to smudge there actually first, so let's do that. Get the smudge brush, smudge these bits up a bit, and just sort of pushing upwards with it to get some of the grey from the base. And in with the multiply brush. Make it nice and dark. Round we go. And back we go, see how that's looking. That's good, probably a little bit too light at the top there. Especially is this one at the bottom? Yes it is, it's right at the bottom, so it needs to be a bit darker. Now it's probably worth tidying this up a bit. I can isolate it, Alt A, link select, and then back to texture paint mode. And just fill in the underside a little bit, make sure that's nice and dark. So Control I for the inverse. Let's go around these areas here. I've got my mix brush on, so it should be just filling those areas in, which it is. And then Alt A to select all, to deselect all, and A to select all. Now around with the multiply brush, a bit less strength. So I think it's really starting to shape up now and looking quite nice. I'm time-lapsing now at 1000%, so you can quickly see me doing pretty much the same thing that I've been doing all along, but just speed it up, so you just get a general idea. Putting in scratches, sorting out the bolts on each side, so multiply and screen brushes, multiply where it's in the shadow, screen where it's hitting the light, always thinking about where the light's coming from. I did have a look at that middle piece again because I realised that the shape was slightly different to how I imagined it. So I just went in with the multiply brush and added a sort of crevice around there. So all pretty much the same as what I've shown so far. Just put a highlight around that very edge there as well. Went to the principled BSDF to see my edges. And just a tiny bit more multiply around some of these bolts and tidying them up. I could have put more of a highlight on some of the bolts actually, I think, looking back at them. It's difficult when you're zoomed in. Sometimes you're not sure how zoomed in you are and how close you're going to be to the model, so you sometimes put too much of a highlight and put too much detail, in fact. So it's looking quite nice. As for the back side, I thought I'd just do this fairly rough. It's unlikely to be seen so much in game, so I'm not too worried. I'm just sort of darkening it up quite a lot. I did decide to work on the handle a bit more than the rest of the back side, but still only really rough, just to get an idea of the fact that there's a handle there, quite simply. One slightly different mode I will show you is the colour mode, and I can actually paint on this colour without losing any of the detail. Not that the detail is particularly brilliant anyway, but I can just paint this colour on. I might go a bit brighter actually, and you can see it just paints the colour and it doesn't lose any of my shading. Like I say, the shading's not amazing anyway, but you can get a rough idea. Always remember to save your image at the end. So there we go, we've got a shield. Thanks to Jayanam, this was good fun, and I hope there's plenty more collaborations along the way. We'll have to make a whole game at some point. So thanks for watching, hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.